But I want to just shift for a moment to the reality that it's one thing to know and it's another to do. And I just want to validate why that can be hard because it can be shaming accidentally. We can shame ourselves and we don't want to. So I want to validate why it's hard so that we don't do that. So for example, most of us that struggle with boundaries, it's because we were raised in an environment where we weren't allowed. We weren't allowed to have any. And we were also forced to feel responsible for the emotions of other people. And so we were very much in a fawn trauma response of really practicing and perfecting stifling self to make others happy, right? So the boundaries we were always crossing were our own to make someone else happy because as a child, that was a smart strategy. Like we needed connection. We needed our caregivers. So at one time that was a very good strategy. The problem is as adults, it's not. But the story that if that person's upset with me, if I share my reality, my perception, if I point out a bad behavior and then I'm shamed, that means I lose connection in childhood. That means, in a way, survival's on the line, right? That story is embedded in our nervous system. We're not consciously thinking that. It happens like that. It's part of our implicit memory. And so when we go to put down boundaries now, we're like, oh, yeah, I can say no, I can do this. The mind says, that's my boundary. And the body says, be quiet, play small, don't say anything. They're going to get angry. They're going to get upset. Because the overcoupling, we talked about overcoupling last week, the overcoupling in the nervous system is boundaries mean something bad is going to happen. Does that, first of all, make sense? Just to kind of throw that out there. And that's why it's challenging. I feel like when we share experiences, it kind of drives it home. I remember the first time that I was shared this information with, and I was hiding getting help. I don't know if anyone, some of you might be in this situation if you are in a relationship with somebody, but I was in a relationship with somebody. And I finally was like, well, it's all my fault. So I'm going to go get help. But this person didn't want me to get help. So I was kind of having to hide my reality. And that therapist told me, he's like, Michelle, like, that's not healthy. Like, healthy relationships, you share, like, this is what I'm doing. He's like, you should tell him. This is start putting down boundaries and expressing, like, this is what I'm doing. This is for me. This is important to me. This is part of my values. And to kind of piggyback on what you said, I was like, are you crazy? Do you know what will happen if I tell him? And I had to come face to face with what my fear was. Now, in my case, I knew I was not going to be touched physically, not to minimize emotional and psychological abuse. I knew I was not going to be touched physically, but my nervous system attached his anger with the same level of threat as like survival threat. What I'm sharing today, any tips that I give on this topic of putting down boundaries, if your life is physically in danger, these are not the tips to do. Safety is what comes first. So I just want to clarify, right? If anyone is in a relationship where their life is in danger and they handle or they have to deal with physical abuse, that's a different topic. Okay. However, he was going to get angry. And when he was angry, I was going to deal with the silent treatment, the monologue, constant shaming. Like I knew that that's what I was going to have to deal with. And it took me a little bit to be like, to realize like, that's not normal that I can't say this to this person. It took me a little bit to really wrap my mind around it. And then I did. I was like, I'm getting help for myself. I have a therapy session on Friday. And everything I was afraid of happening happened. Like he did the silent treatment. It was the constant shaming, the constant anger to try to get me to not do it. I'm hoping you guys resonate with this. The difference was when we start living within our boundaries, and I'll never forget the therapist said, he's like, he will get worse and you will get better. And I didn't quite understand it at that moment. But from that first time that I started putting down the boundaries, instead of trying to over explain and convince him, it was simply, this is a decision that I made. It's very important to me, to my mental health, and I have to do this. I hope you'll support it. Da, 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 da. That's what happened. That was my decision. I'm going to be going. It was nonstop. I kid you not. At night, I'd be in bed and I'd pray, can please help me to go to sleep. And thankfully I would be able to go to sleep. But my point is, because I was living in my own boundaries, I was starting to feel like me. My boundaries are around me. I wasn't even in my own boundaries. I was outside of myself trying to make someone else happy all the time. So I didn't have the safety in the relationship and I didn't have the safety inside of myself. When I started putting down boundaries, I was able to watch from me, from being within me, like, oh, that's him. Oh my goodness, he looks like he's foaming at the mouth. And I'm allowed to do this. This is important to me. I need this. And I started to, for the first time, feel like myself again. So I want to stress for anyone that's in a relationship with somebody that's possibly high on the scale of NPD, boundaries, and this is what I had to learn, they are not about making the other person happy. My boundary with my yard, if I put up a fence, is not for my neighbor. It's for me. And it's the same thing with our boundaries. And I also had to learn that people are allowed to be upset. Somewhere in my past, someone programmed me to be like, I'm going to make everyone happy. You're upset. I'm going to work really hard to make you happy, even if it hurts me. No, I had to learn, like, I'm sorry you're upset. You're allowed to be upset. I don't have to rescue you from being upset if that's the emotion you want to be in. And I'm allowed to recognize that this is something that is important to me. So that was one example. Another example, with my mom, there were certain topics that she loved to kind of bring up, a little bit of what I was saying. They love to bring up things just to get a reaction from you. We call them like baited conversations. They'll ask a question. It seems innocent. It's really not. They want you to answer so that they can then shame you, right? So my boundary, after years of realizing I had no boundaries with this and getting hurt with every conversation, I made the decision, okay, well, what's my boundary? My boundary is anytime this topic comes up, I'm going to end the call. So my first step, and this is where like somebody else said something interesting too, so I love like the shares, you guys bring it all to life. There's a balance needed, right? Do we just go around like crazy boundaries all over the place? Like, how do we do it in a way that's reasonable? My first way I put that down with my mom was letting her know this topic's off limits. Like, mom, if this comes up, like, I'm not going to participate in this conversation. Now, anyone high on the scale hears that. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to use that, right, as a topic of conversation. So my second, it's almost like stages. That was my step one, was to mention the boundary. Step two was to reiterate it. So when she did it, remind her, Mom, remember, this is a topic that we're not having, I'm not involved in this topic. She did it in that same conversation. She kept on. So that's when I had to enforce it. It was up to me, not her. Sometimes I know with myself, I used to think I needed them to respect it for me to feel like I could enforce it. But no, I had to be the one to enforce it. So it was like, okay, Mom, anyway, love you, gotta go, ciao. And that was the enforcing part, comes from us. There are people that will respect your boundaries once you start setting them. There are people that won't. And that's when we have to have clarity. Well, when this person gives that backlash, how can I enforce it? So thinking about whatever boundary you are thinking of setting. And thinking about when you go to enforce it, any backlash that would come your way, what are some ways that you can enforce it? And if you have any questions about that or anything comes up as we're talking about this part, we could bring it to the table.